pokerstrategy.com. This is my second video of my series 10 tips to get out of the micros, and on this video number 2 we're going to talk about fold less on the blinds. That's my tip number 2. If you didn't watch my first video, I suggest you stop this video and go back and watch the first episode. I think it would be useful and it would help to understand better this one. So, fold less on the blinds. I think that this is a major problem for a standard reg that's trying to beat these stakes, 25NL, 50NL, 10NL, because common classic old knowledge would say that we should avoid playing out of position as much as possible, and you guys, some of you at least, would remember some of those very old advices and on old books that said, yeah, don't chase your blinds, blah blah blah, whatever. And we know nowadays that that's not really true, and I hope that with this video you will understand better why. And I would say this is one of the major differences that you would see between a regular in a 25NL stake and a regular at the 200NL stake. So let's begin. I've showed you this table on the first episode, but I'm gonna show you again, not for the same purposes, but these are the same numbers. In my first video, I was reasoning with you guys to explain why I think it's a very good idea for you guys to steal very wide from the button in a small line, and this table was to show you that the 25NL reg would fold a lot on the blinds. But if we look at it from the other perspective, it's also useful to say that you guys, you are the 25NL regs, and that means most of you are folding a lot on the blinds, and that means you should exploit people that fold a lot on the blinds. That was the first episode, but that means you should yourself play better from the blinds, and you should not have these numbers. You should have numbers close to these ones in 200NL. Not gonna say exactly these numbers, but a lot closer than they are right now. And although this difference is huge regarding blind defense, if you check that out, the button and small blind steal percentage between these two stakes are not that big, or not nearly as big as this. So you cannot have that argument that we fold more on the blinds because button and small blind steals are tighter. That's not really true. So let me give you a practical example. So a regular on the button raises min raise to big blinds, the small blind folds, and hero is on the big blind with a hand like Jack 4 suited. What would you do? Well, I guess the audience to this video would have very different responses. I guess more and more people would say less the fold answer. Less and less people would consider that option, and I think we cannot think about folding here. So this should be either a call or a 3-bet. I think this is a standard call, but we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just look at this spot objectively and use some math and come up with some conclusions. So let's start with pot odds. So villain min raises on the button for 2 big blinds. So small blind folds, we are on the big blind, and yeah, we have to put 1 big blind on the pot, right? Because 1 is already on the table, to fight for a pot that's gonna have 4.5 big blinds, right? 2 from the button, 2 from our blind, from our call, and a half big blind from small blind. So that gives us pot odds of 22.2%. Now, okay, that's step number 1. Now let's try to calculate our equity over our hand against, let's say, around 50% open from the button. I already did that. I think that saves us some time. So it's close to 40%, 39, 40%. That's our equity against villain's opening range on the button. So if you compare these numbers, we can say with certainty, at least, that if we were guaranteed to check down post flop, that would mean a very easy call pre-flop, right? We have 40% equity, 22% pot odds, like snap call. Because post flop we will go check, 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 and we win around 40% of the time, and we have 22% pot odds, so that means we are printing money. And by that I mean calling is way, way, way better than folding. And that's pretty much the same thing if villain was all in, right? If villain was all in pre-flop for 2 big blinds, we have a snap call on the big blind because we have enough pot odds. But a thought just arose in your mind. That's okay, double, but we are not checking down post flop. We have to face bets and see bets, and we are dominated, and yeah, so on and so forth. And that's a problem with equity realization problem, right? So you guys are thinking that we can't realize all of this equity. We are not guaranteed to see a showdown. We are not guaranteed to realize our 40% equity. My answer to that problem is this. Even if we make a discount on our equity, so we put a factor that removes us our practical equity, and what I mean is saying that, let's say that we can only realize 75% of our equity, so we would multiply 75% for 40%, and my point is that should give us a number that's still a lot bigger than 22%. That should give us around 30%. That's still a lot bigger than 22%, and that should mean we should call, because we still have good enough equity and good enough pot odds to call and make the call at least somewhat better than a fold. And that's my point. And I would say that 75% equity realization factor, let's call that, I mean, it's whatever. Some good players would say that's pessimistic. 75% would be a pessimistic number. But even if we go be really, really pessimistic and we would say 60% or whatever, we still have a profitable call comparing to folding preflop. I hope that makes sense. I mean, our pot odds are just really, really good, and it's not by random chance that you see a guy like oh well, I'm getting a blank here. That guy from High Sauce. It's not by mistake that you see a good player like Sauce calling with this situation with a hand like 8-4 offsuit. I'm not saying for you guys to do that, but it illustrates my point, right? Yeah, you're gonna say, yeah, but he plays high stakes. He is a great player. The rake is way lower. Okay, but that's an extreme case. But my point remains: if Sauce can call an 8-4 off on the big blind versus a min raise on button, why can't you call a hand like Jack-4 suited in the same situation? That's just, those hands are just very, very different. Jack-4 suited is way, way, way better than 8-4 offsuit. And again, I used this argument on the first video, but I will use it again. It's not, you cannot say, but Sauce is a great player, I'm a weak player, I can't call because I'm gonna suck post flop. And my answer to that is, yeah, well, your opponent also sucks. And even if he has position, even if he has initiative, your skill difference is not that big that you have to fold a hand such as this. So there's actually no excuse, in my opinion, to fold Jack-4 suited versus a min raise from the button, unless in the miracle that villain is the king of the nits and he's opening really a tight range. But I'm talking about regulars so to speak, on these stakes that open 40-50% wherever. My other point is that it has to do with the fact that you should be aware of this. We have 22% pot odds, so we should have realistic expectations about how our end is going to play out on the post flop. And by that I mean that given that we have 22% pot odds, in practice that should mean that you don't need to win the pot that often to make it a profitable call pre-flop. I don't know if I got this through. Since you have such good pot odds, you can check fold a lot on the flop, and that doesn't mean necessarily that you are playing worse than folding pre-flop. You see my point? So my point is, don't spew, and I'm gonna repeat this later, but don't spew. Just play solid. I'm gonna try to show you what that means, but you should have realistic expectations about your hand. And other thing that's important, if you go to your database and you filter hands that you folded on the blind versus a min raise from button, you will see, of course, that your win rate in that spot is minus 100 BBs per 100 hands, right? You fold your big blind, yeah, every time, so 100 hands, 100 big blinds negative, right? So when you call, right, when you call and you want to compare how are you doing comparing folding to calling or whatever, if you are being profitable with those hands, if you filter that in your database, and it has to be a huge sample. So let's say you filter hands like Jack 6 suited to Jack deuce suited, and Queen 6 suited to Queen deuce suited, and 10 6 suited to 10 deuce suited, and you select these hands, and you select when you call them in raise from the button, huge sample, and the numbers you're looking for is numbers higher than minus 100 BBs per 100. So if you filter that situation and you go and you see a number that's negative, like minus 50 BBs per 100 hands, that's not a negative number, right? Because when you fold, you are minus 100 BBs per 100. Some of you already know that, but I think it's useful to say that. So you don't need to be on the green, because you are on the green. It's just that you have to compare the two options, and the other option, folding pre-flop, you already lose 100 BPs per 100. So this is not set in stone, this range. This is supposedly a calling range on the big line versus a 2 BB open from button. I'm not here to discuss these borderline hands. So some players will say I'm terrible because we should be calling all king X off, and we should be calling a lot more hands profitably. Some players will say that, well, we should be playing a bit tighter because rake is higher, whatever. It's not my point. It's obvious that the frontier hands, the close hands, are open to debate. It's not very important because they are already close to break-even decisions. My point is, a hand like Jack 5 suited should not be open to discussion. It's a clear call. Okay? Same for King 7 off. Same for 10-9 off. Okay? That's my main point. And I'm guessing that most of you are not doing that. And I know most of you are not doing that. Because I know. At least some of you. And I know you are not doing, or you were not doing this. Okay? So you were 3-betting these hands and whatever, and or folding mostly. So what about 3-bets? Well, because most of you guys were 3-betting hands like 8-7 suited and 7-6 suited and 9-8 suited, and because you were told that those are good 3-bet hands. That just means that these hands are definitely good enough to call, and that just means that we have to have a 3-bet bluff range, because we can't only 3-bet this part of our range that's for value. So what hands are we 3-betting as a bluff? Well, weaker hands, right? These ones here, pretty much most of these, like 9-5 suited and 9 deuce suited and 7-4 suited and 5-4 suited and 5-3 suited and 4-3 suited, hands like that. Maybe the occasional king X off or queen X off. Not a lot, because these are offsuit combos, so there are a lot, 12 of them, 12 of each, and they are not very good as a playability post flop, but you can use some of them, and a lot of these weak suited hands should be cool to use. So I guess there's that. So now I guess most of you are thinking, wow, how can I play such bad hands like king 5 off or king 6 off post flop. I don't know how to play that. I don't know how to play such a wide range, and I'm going to give you some tips regarding that. So I'm telling you again, don't feel compelled to fight for every pot. You should be check folding when you don't have anything on the flop, and that should be the majority of the time with a lot of these hands. You should be check folding a lot of the time, and that does not mean you are doing a mistake. That does not mean you should not be calling pre-flop. I just explain you why. Pot odds, equity, etc. And you don't need to do much better by calling than by folding. So don't spew, please. Any pair is usually good enough to check call on the flop. There are some boards that we should not check call bottom pair, and those boards are usually ones that have a lot of draws, a lot of gut shots. So maybe on well, let's give a classical example. On an 8-6-5 we should not be check calling 5x, but on a queen 6 deuce we should be calling 2x. Okay. A lot of the good draws, including flush draws and gut shots with overcard, or even without the overcard, usually are good enough to check call and float out of position. We don't have the need for a check raise. They are good enough to float out of position. Well, I'm going to elaborate on that a bit later on some examples, but yeah, this should mean that most flush draws you should be check calling on most of flops, and open-ended same thing. So either a flush draw is strong enough to check raise, and that should mean flush draw plus pair, or sometimes the nut flush draw, or then you should be check calling for the most part, although you could check raise some flush draws because, well, for balance purposes, but that's just not really necessary in practice. Okay, another tip. Second pair usually goes on the check call, check fold line. Yeah, not on every board, but you see my point. Second pair, you usually don't call 3 streets on most boards. You usually check call twice unless the board gets ugly and you have to check fold the turn, etc. But usually the second pair type hands should be on a check call, check fold line. And top pair type hands, you almost always call twice. Yeah, pretty much always. Can't really see an example where you have to check fold the turn. So you check call twice, flop and turn, and decide on the river to bluff catch or not. And it's hard to say in a vacuum, but speaking from a theoretical point of view, you should be check calling a lot of rivers with top pair. In practice, I think on these stakes, people don't bluff enough on the river, so we should adjust by folding more to 3 barrels. But yeah, that, I guess it depends on your hand and the board and the player. But yeah, that's always a tough spot when you face 3 barrel and we have a top pair. Yeah, we have a bluff catcher, right? It's a bluff catcher situation. It's like whatever. I put this slide to remember you guys the relationship between hand strength and line take, and I think this is important, and I'm not sure that every one of you has this in mind. So if we take our best hand and go by our range until we reach the worst hand, we should, with our best hands, we should check raise for value, right? Unless we want to slow play for some reason or not, but we check raise for value our best hands. Then the hands that are not strong enough to check raise, we check call. So they are strong enough to check call, but not strong enough to check raise, and they are too strong to check raise as a bluff, and they are too strong to check fold. Next, we have hands that are we check call, they are good enough to float out of position, so we can't really call them check call value hands. It's just the fact they are good enough to float, maybe bluff the river, maybe value bet when we hit, so maybe they are draws, maybe they are top pair with a good kicker, etc. The top pair with a good kicker is this one, of course, but what I mean here is draws mostly, overcards, draws, maybe bottom pair when the board runs bad, you could bluff the river, etc. Those hands, I mean. And then we check raise as a bluff, hands that are not strong enough to do this, that they are not strong enough to check call and float out of position. So this is the more important part, I guess. So you have to keep in mind that there's a distinction. You should be those hands, the check raises bluff hands, are weaker hands than the check call out of position float. Okay, so you check raise as a bluff hands, you cannot check call the flop with intention of floating. Okay, and we check fold our worst hands. Of course, we always have to have a check folding range, almost always. So let's take an example. Button mirror raises and the small blind folds and hero calls on the big blind, and we see this flop. How does hero construct his range when villain c-bets to third spots on this flop when once hero calls BB versus button? Okay, so we can't say that we should check all pairs. We could potentially check raise some top pairs, but yeah, you don't have to. Maybe check raise king queen or something, but yeah, you definitely don't have to. I would check all pairs. We should check all any gut shots we have. So if we have 5-4 suited, we should be check calling that. We should be check calling most of our flush draws, and we should be check raising our flush plus pair flush draws. So ace deuce of spades should be a check raise, and yeah, king deuce of spades, jack deuce of spades, there all should be check raises on the flop. And what more hands should we be check calling the flop? So all pairs, all gut shots. There are not a lot, but all gut shots, and then some strong ace size. So ace 10 should be a check call on this flop, especially if we have a spade. Ace 9 is close, but yeah, if we have a spade, it's strong enough to check call again. And maybe some hand like king jack of clubs could be good enough to check call, although you could check raise. I don't think you should be check folding a hand like king jack of clubs. Maybe check call is good, check raise should be good as well. It's your choice. Yeah, same for I mentioned king jack of clubs, but yeah, pretty much you should be continuing with all king jacks, I guess. Maybe you can fold the ones without a spade and without clubs, but yeah, it's close. You could check raise, you could check all. We are talking already about borderline hands. So a hand like king 10, I mean king 9 is a check fold for the most part, and yeah, king 10 is really close. So yeah, and that's pretty much hero's range, and you realize we are check folding a lot. We are check folding a lot. Okay, so keep that in mind. We are calling with a wide range, and we miss this board with a lot of hands, and we are check folding a lot of hands, but that's okay. Okay, let's see another example. So the board changed. Now it's queen of spades, ace of spades, 7 of hearts, and now we face again a bet of 66% of the pot. And this board, I think it's a bit easier to construct our range. So hero should be check calling all pairs. The bottom pair we should be planning to bluff the river when the board gets bad, like a spade comes or Broadway comes, and we don't have to always bluff the river. If the board blanks out, we could just check it down. Yeah, so top pair we check call twice all the time, and queen x, well, if the turn is a really bad card, you could check fold some queen x, like you check call queen 9 of clubs on this flop, and the turn is a jack. It doesn't have to be spades, but yeah, jack of spades you check fold. Even without the spade, maybe you should check fold. And then gut shots you should be check call floating. So yeah, jack 10, king jack, king 10. We should be check calling on the flop with the intention of bluffing the river when the turn goes check check. What else? Yeah, we don't really have a check raising range. Okay. So yeah, we should not be check raising, mostly because yeah, well, SI boards are not very good for check raises, and actually this board favors a bit villain in a sense that he has a bunch of nuts, like he has ace. I don't mean a bunch, but I mean the top of his range is a lot better than ours, and by that I mean he has aces, queens, and ace queen, and we don't have any of that, so worse to check raise for that reason as well. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And yeah, flush draws, we just um, check call a lot of them, and maybe yeah, 7x of spades. We are tempted to check raise, but maybe we should just check call since we don't have a check raising range. Okay, so that covers defending versus button. I hope that was useful to you. So from the small line, we kind of have, and when I mean general approach to small line is versus steal from button, cutoff, and even early position. Talking about small line facing raise, it's not easy to have a calling range. We're always out of position. We always have the possibility of getting in a multi-way pot or a squeeze because yeah, big blind is still to act, and he might overcall since he has very good odds. He might squeeze. That's a very good spot for him to squeeze, especially if the open raise comes from button or cutoff. So we don't close the action mainly. So it's a lot harder to it's even harder to realize equity on the small blind than it is on the big blind where you close the action and you are guaranteed to see a flop. So calling from the small blind is really tricky. And of course we have a capped and usually very defined range, right? So if the cutoff opens and we are on a small blind, we have a problem because the hands we are calling, I mean the frequencies we are calling there, it's not very loose. So it's like, I don't know, well, I'm not sure, but it's definitely a defined range, and it's kind of easy to cut off to play against us post flop because it's really easy to realize what type of hands we have. And yeah, worse odds, of course. So what about if we do a 3-bet or fold strategy from the small line? So we never call, even against UTG or MP, we just 3-bet or fold. And there are a lot of advantages. I'm not saying this is a better strategy. I mean, yeah, I think it is a better strategy, but I can see that that may not be true. But I think it's a very I mean, it's definitely a good strategy, and you should consider it. So, advantages of 3-bet or fold strategy. So, less likely we face an uncomfortable situation, since once we 3-bet, the big blind kinda he has to call for bet or fold and or call the 3-bet. So that's not at all good options for him. So we really make it less likely we face a multi-way pot or a squeeze pot, of course. We see less flops, so we diminish our positional disadvantage. Of course, now we have an uncapped range because, as we will see when we play 3-bet or fold, of course, our range is depolarized, and we, of course, when we 3-bet, we have all the great hands like monsters and kings plus and queens and ace king and whatever. So, how about use a depolarized range, right? So, what's a depolarized range? Well, we could bring up Equilab, and a depolarized range just means it's not polarized. It's the opposite of polarized. So a polarized range would be a range that 3-bets the best hands and then call with these hands, like these ones and these ones, call with these hands, and then 3-bet next, like the hands that are not good enough to call. This is a polarized 3-bet strategy. So since we are playing 3-bet or fold on a small blind, we are going to play a depolarized strategy, and by that I mean we 3-bet our best hands and we don't call anything and we fold the rest. So it looks a lot like this. Okay, so this is a depolarized 3-betting range. How do we define our 3-bet frequencies on the small line? It's actually somewhat easy to come up with good ranges. We should be 3-betting about 1/3 of villain's opening range, and if we don't know villain's range, we just estimate. So let's assume a situation where a regular you don't have many info on is opening on the button min raise, and we are on a small blind. What range should we be 3-betting them? Well, I would say, well, since he's a regular that's opening min raise on the button, I assumed he is opening at least 45, 50. 50 is more realistic range, I guess. So let's say he opens around 50% from the button. So if we want to 3-bet depolarize from the small blind, we should be 3-betting 1/3 of 50%, and that should gives us what, 17% around. I think so. Yeah, close to that. So 17% around that. So bring up Equilab again. So 17% depolarized range. What does that mean? Well, close to that, I guess. Of course, you can play out with this range a bit. So maybe you don't want to 3-bet King 10 off, and you would rather 3-bet like this, and that's fine, perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with it. Same if you want to do this, I don't have a problem also. So yeah, just be mindful of this frequency and try to get close to it more or less, and just yeah. And of course we can use this against any open raise from any position. So let's say we are in a small blind facing a cutoff open. So now we would say, well, he opens around 25%, 27%. So now I'm gonna 3-bet around 9% or whatever, close to that. So we just reduce our range until we reach 9%, around 9%, something like this. Okay, and then middle position again. We of course, if you have the sample and you can look exactly at his opening range, you can adjust this accordingly. But if you don't, you just estimate. So MP, let's say 18%, so 1/3 of 18 is 6. So now we just keep reducing these hands and just come up with something like this, more or less, give or take. We should be 3-betting around this frequency. And the Gust UTG, you see my point, you just reduce until you get to 5% or whatever. So as you can see, constructing ranges on the small blind is actually quite easy, I would say. Of course, you can adjust not only based on the open raise, but also on the fold to 3-bet, of course. If Villa folds a lot to 3-bet, and when I say a lot, it's probably more than 60%, you should start to 3-bet wider. And yeah, when I say wider, just don't go nuts, of course. Be sensitive, I guess, be wise. But yeah, you should increase substantially your 3-bet, because yeah, he's folding enough and you make more money by 3-betting than folding. Last but not least is the general approach when he raises on the big blind and he's facing an open raise from the small blind. Well, what can we say about this? First, we have position, we have good odds even if he opens 3x. Villain's range is usually loose, and you know it is. Most players open wide from the small blind, and correctly they open wide, and I told you on the first video to open wide because regulars in these stakes fold the big blind too much. So, and on the big blind close the pre-flop action, so we are guaranteed to see a flop against a wide range with good pot odds. So that should mean that we should give no peace to small blind. We should make his life a living hell, and that should mean we should not be folding much. So I'm gonna give you a close approximation from what numbers you should be looking at. So a good way to get your numbers close to ideal is by doing this. Your calling frequency, your calls versus the small blind steal should be close to the exact percentage villain is stealing, and your 3-bet frequency should be around 40% of that number. Maybe this is too loose, but let's take a look at it. So let's assume again that villain is open raising from the small blind 50% of hands. So now with 50% of hands, you should be calling around 50%, and you should be 3-betting 40% of 50%. And that, if you do that calculation, you'll see that you would have to 3-bet 20% of hands. So let's start by trying to come up with a solid 3-bet range. So let's say that your 3-bet as for value is this. You could go wider, but let's say this is it. So 3-bets. We are already at 8, so now we should get close to 20%. But of course now we should take a look of what our calling range should look like to get to 50%. So let's just clear that and then try to come up with our calling range, and we'll see where that gets us. Of course, again, I'm not here to discuss borderline hands. You can, of course, play the borderline hands. Of course you can. Just trying to get to 50%. Yeah, we're close to it. Maybe, yeah, something like, you can actually call this one also. So we are around that number. So again, I'm not here to discuss if you should call or not king deuce off. Maybe you should 3-bet those, maybe, and then play like this, and that's close enough to 50%. It's not, of course, this approximation is not set in stone, it's just a guideline. So if we call around this and 3-bet for value as this, and then again this was around 9% the 3-bet for value, and now you should already guess, now we should put another at least 10% of hands for 3-bet bluffs, so this should come to 56 or something. So yeah, something like this, and we are already there, more or less. Okay, so this should bring you close to what you should be doing, and if you didn't realize already, you are folding very little, and it's similar, even if small blinds opens 3x, because if small blind opens 2.5, I mean, I don't think I'm folding anything. Maybe fold the complete trash hands around this area, but yeah, you should not be folding much, given you get better odds. And against the min raise, I would not fold anything. I would not fold 3 deuce off. I would not fold 7 deuce off. Either 3-bet or call. It's fine if Villain min raises from small blind. So again, I'm not saying to use these exact ranges. I'm just saying that, I mean, a Jack 5 suited, in my opinion, it's a clear call against the 3x from a small blind that you think is opening, or you know it's opening around 50% of hands. It's just not close. You have position, you have good odds, etc. Okay, and you have equity, good equity actually, against villain's range. And you realize more of that because you are in position, of course. I think this was, I'm not sure. Okay, so to conclude, let's make some points to finalize the video. So, contrary to what classical advice says, as I said in the beginning, you should be defending your blinds loosely, either by calling or by 3-betting. But mostly by calling, because most of you 3-bet, I mean, some of you 3-bet close to what the frequency you should, but the problem is you don't call nearly enough. So you are 3-betting hands, you should be calling, and you are folding hands, you should be 3-betting. Remember that you only need to do a little bit better by calling than by folding. Remember that the thing I said about checking your database and the win rates and the pot odds you get. So watch out for spews. Don't just because you see a lot of flops with weak hands, please don't be obsessed with check raising. You guys ask a lot about check raise bluffing, a lot, and that's a minor detail in my opinion about your post flop decisions, and you should be just play solid for the most part and don't start check raising backdoor straight every time. Your frequencies, of course, should vary according to villain's tendencies, but it's very useful if you have a predefined game plan and then adjust based on the tendencies you see on villain. Because if you make all of your decisions on the go on the tables, it's very likely you will get decisions that are very far from ideal. And again, I said this in my first video, but I'll say it again. Sooner or later, you will have to play marginal hands post flop. It's just the way it is, because button is raising a very small fraction, and with a really wide range, big blind does not have a choice but to call with also with a very wide range. So being in it pre-flop and postponing this issue is not the solution. So you should start working on your post flop game, and it's not as hard as you think. And you'll see you'll get up in the stakes real quick if you put your mind to it. And I guess this is important. And don't, I see a lot, and maybe this should be one of the tips. you should be very careful regarding variance in mental game. I see a lot of you guys on a small sample trying to take conclusions that are just ridiculous. Like, yeah, I must be doing something bad because I'm losing on a 20k hands run, or in my eyes, this is not working, and you just have a bias about uh, the situation. Like, yeah, it's not working for me to call such weekends because I'm check folding a lot of flops. This is probably minus EV, and it's